we're going to get started. The format for this meeting, I think, is going to be me presenting a little bit, kind of where my headspace is, and then we'll dialogue and answer questions that people have. And I want to get through what I have to present to folks, and then spend the majority of the time on answering questions or discussing things. So without further ado, Ways and Means, I'm the chair of Ways and Means, House Ways and Means, and our purpose is to help find a solution to the revenue problem that we have, the budget deficit that we have, and find efficiencies for government. And that's where I've been focused as the chair during this session. I'm also chair of the Legislative Budget and Audit Committee, and that committee usually meets mostly during the interim. It's met a couple times, and there's been a few things that I've been working on. The governor and the legislature have been involved in a legal dispute over some FERC funds. It's a fairly complicated thing, and I'm not sure that I can explain it to you all right now. I wasn't prepared to talk about it, but just to let you know that that lawsuit is going forward right now, and we've got to figure out whether the money that had been spent in the past that the legislature says should have gone to the CBR instead of it going into the general funds should in the future go to the CBR instead of the general funds. And if the lawsuit were to be in our favor, then we would end up owing the CBR more than $1 billion, close to $1.5 billion. That money doesn't exist. It's already been spent. It's previous legislature appropriations. So thus far, the judge has ruled in favor of the governor, and the legislature is kind of on the I don't know what the legal term would be, but we're on the losing end of that argument. To me, it doesn't really matter where this money comes or goes. Either it goes to this general fund or it goes to the CBR. Either way, it's green and it can be spent. I understand the impacts for why it might want to be in the CBR. It's harder to spend it from there. But anyway, we're also having to spend money in a lawsuit to quibble over where this money should go, which is also frustrating to me. So we've got some decisions to make in that regard as to how to bring that lawsuit quickly to an end and end the dispute between the legislature and the executive branch. Anyway, just one of the things that is distracting us from solving our fiscal problems down here. So Ways and Means has put together some documents to kind of explain in a nutshell what our thinking is on a fiscal plan. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and show you what that document is. There we go. Okay. We took the fiscal policy working group that I was a member of, and that occurred in 2021, summer of 2021. It was July and August of 2021. And we said the report that came out of that effort, which was a bipartisan and bicameral, meaning both Senate and House, and then both majority caucus and minority caucus members were part of that from both bodies. And that report created a plan or a framework for things that we could do that would help stabilize our finances at the state. We took that report and we created a 4-point focus with some pieces of legislation that we would be able to act upon. Regarding accountability and efficient spending, we've got and have already passed out House Joint Resolution 2 and House Bill 38 that establish a spending limit based on gross domestic product of the state. Still in the committee are the 3 remaining pieces of legislation. HB 110 and HJR 7 are meant to constitutionalize the PFD and clear up the statute so that there is a statutory requirement to pay the PFD every year, and that's backed up by the Constitution. In effect, what HJR 7 does is allow the legislature to dedicate the permanent fund earnings as designed in law. as established by law. So because of the Wielkowski case, the legislature right now, and because the constitutional provision against the dedication of funds exists, the legislature can choose to not follow the PFD law during the appropriations process. Frankly, it can choose to not follow any law if the appropriations process wants to do something different than what's on statute, unless the constitutional authority exists to dedicate those funds. So HJR 7 dedicates the permanent fund earnings to a purpose that is defined in law. The political problem within the building is that there isn't consensus on putting a particular number in the Constitution, and I'm also a proponent that we probably should not do that, because whatever the number is today might not be the right number tomorrow or 10 years from now. And so the approach that we took was to dedicate the funds coming out of the permanent fund per the statute. That means that the legislature doesn't need to appropriate in order to make the permanent fund dividend happen. It just happens because it's dedicated. So House Bill 110 would dedicate the fund to paying 50% of the 5% of market value to government and 50% to permanent fund dividends. And that is an acknowledgement that there is not the will in the body to pay a statutory dividend and cut government. It is those two things would be required, or raising taxes of some sort to pay the statutory dividend. So, and I'll explain a little bit more of that later. So that's just the political reality in the building, trying to solve the problem on a bipartisan approach. So economic growth is important for our state, and House Bill 109 does two things. It reduces the corporate income tax rate down to a flat 2% for all your corporations that pay, your C Corps that pay income tax. And then it creates a broad-based 2% sales tax that would be applied as broadly as we could across the Alaskan economy. And this is to meet the political demand for additional revenues that was an outgrowth of the Fiscal Policy Working Group. So the reality is that whether you're talking about revenue generation with a new tax of some sort, or whether you're talking about a spending limit, which is what we first passed out of the bill, out of the committee, or whether you're talking about a solution to the PFD problem, none of those solutions get solved within the legislature on their own. There's not enough will, there's not enough votes to pass legislation for any one of those particular subjects. So the approach that we have taken is to try to find some common ground with a package of bills that would enable us that everybody gets a little and everybody gives a little, so that we can stabilize our finances. The reason that the stabilization of the finances is so important is because this body doesn't generally focus on economic growth. We're not really concerned with that, and that's a problem in my opinion. And I'm going to move to another slide to kind of segue into another conversation here that's related. And if you have questions on this particular thing, we can come back to it. All right. So let's talk about revenue for a second. Back when oil was found, the state made some decisions to eliminate an income tax and rely upon oil revenue. And that served the state well when the price of oil is high and production is high. And over many, many years, it did very good for the state. We were able to weather some of the ups and downs with regarding price of oil because we had a lot of money put away in our CBR. But through the years, the tax policies have changed in regards to oil, and when oil production started to decline, the legislature has continued to look at different ways to continue to increase the amount of money coming out of our oil industry for state coffers. So that's how we got the ACES tax scheme that was passed a number of years ago that generated more revenue for the state. The challenge that we have is that revenue stream, given the political climate and the production of oil in a natural state of decline, means that revenue stream is always going to be in decline if we aren't continuing to produce more oil. And as everybody is fully aware, it was a major effort to get Willow passed, and getting any other oil production on the North Slope is going to be a near impossibility under the current national and international political climate. And it's not just an election thing. It's not just we need a new president, a new regime nationally. Companies have a very hard time finding capital in Alaska to do investment projects in oil and gas. And that is a problem that's not going away anytime soon with an election at a national change of presidency or change of Congress and Senate. So anyway, so we're going to continue to have a low and fluctuating source of revenue for oil. So as you know, over the past decade, as our price of oil has fluctuated and hasn't been enough to pay for our state government, we've dipped into our CBR, our constitutional budget reserve, which used to have almost $20 billion in it. 16 billion, I think, is maybe what the number I remember in my head. Anyway, we've continually spent that down. We've reduced our budget some. A good share of what we reduced over the years has been capital spend, but we have done some statewide and operational budget reductions over the last decade. But we're still at a point where the size of government and the growth of government is not keeping up with our economy, largely oil and other taxes, to pay for it. And so we had to dip into our CBR. And at this rate, if we were to continue to dip into the CBR to help solve that problem, the lack of revenue problem, without doing some more drastic cuts, right? And I'll get to that in a minute. You've only got 1 to 2 years of available spend in the CBR before it's gone. And we don't have, to say, any other super significant sources of revenue that we could that are in this ballpark size wise. So this is kind of the last savings that we have. So the legislature has started finding revenue from the permanent fund through the earnings program, the earnings sharing program that we had established with the permanent fund dividend. So it used to be that we had what is termed the statutory formula, which is basically a 21% of net earnings transfer to the dividend, half of that to the dividend program and half of it to government. That was the traditional statutory formula. And that is still on the books, but we passed another law that says we're going to, instead of following that one, we're going to follow a 5% of market value draw. And that doesn't just happen with an appropriation or with a transfer, it happens with an appropriation. So then the legislature has to fight over, we have to decide how to spend that 5% of market value draw. Well, since I got elected in 2018, the narrative had changed and had shifted away from a statutory formula. There were still several of us that were saying that would be the better way to do it. The better use of the 50% of that transfer would be to put it into people's hands and into the private sector. But that is not the will that is carrying the day in the legislature today. So the 5% of market value draw is that has the most votes for it in the legislature right now. We have been discussing since I got elected on a 50-50 split of that POMV structure. 50% for the dividend and 50% for state government. There are really close to a majority of legislators that would like to see a 50-50 split. It's very close. What is catching the eye of people now, and what is really coming to forefront because of the budget that we have, is a 25-75 split. And this is what is being reflected in the Senate budget that is likely to be passed to the House here very soon. And this is 25% of the POMV draw for permanent fund dividend program and 75% to government spend. The reality is that there's no statute that's saying that 2575 is the amount. So it could be a 60-40, it could be a 10-90. It's just up to the legislature, up to the finance committees to decide what that appropriation is going to be to the dividend program. In essence, the legislature is treating it no different than any other component of the budget, just like an education demand, a health and social services, or public safety, roads, all of that. It competes with all of that for the size of the dividend. So the challenge is that as our growth of the government continues, you can see that of the states, this is largely the only really relevant tax structure revenues that we have, or ability to pay for state government. Yes, we receive federal funds, but they're largely dedicated to specific programs. Yes, we have some other taxes that come in, fish tax and other small taxes, gas tax that you pay at the pump when you fill up your vehicle. There are other taxes, but they're not significant. They're not going to be able to help stabilize the budget. So we're in a trajectory, and there are many people in the building that would like to just see the permanent fund grow. And if you hear somebody say, "Hey, we need to get the fund to be like $100 billion," we need to grow it that way. Many in the building have thought that that's what needs to happen. And over the last couple budgets, we've put about $9 billion transferred from our earnings reserve account, which is the earnings of the fund over the last few years. And we've transferred that into the corpus so that it can't be spent. The folks that want to see that happen are the folks that are saying we need to grow this fund to get as large as possible, as quickly as possible, so that it kicks off revenue for state spending. And that is kind of where without changing anything, that's where we're headed, because we're not going to see a revenue increase, consistent revenue increase from Prudhoe Bay or the other taxes that we pay. So with continued government spend, the only place that the legislature can go for additional revenue is the permanent fund dividend program or institute more taxes. And obviously this is saying that it doesn't have a will to cut spending, to reduce spending, right? So that's the trajectory that the legislature's on right now. So within a couple of years, without any changes, this 25-75 split will continue to erode till there's no dividend left, because government is going to continue to grow. It just naturally grows. Need to be disciplined, and you need to have a whole lot of people that are willing to stand up against the torrent of folks that demand government spending to solve their problems. Granted, there's a necessary need for state government, but not every problem needs state government. So anyway, so the question becomes, what's next, right? It is a foregone conclusion that government is going to continue to grow every year. We can take a whack at it. We can adjust policies that reduce spending, but simple inflation causes things to grow, and that government growth is going to happen. But you can see that our economy isn't on this. Outside of oil, our economy isn't on this chart. We don't have anything that's tied to economic growth in the state other than our oil money. So even if our economy was to grow and you had a boom in some industry within the state, if they weren't paying into the corporate income tax, if they were LLCs, for example, or S corps, then they wouldn't be paying taxes into the state corporate income tax. So there's not a connection to our revenue stream. So even if our economy was to grow, it's not going to help the problem of government growth and population growth. So the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to go to more oil taxes. It's not the only thing that'll happen. That's what the thinking in the building right now is going towards, we just need to tax oil more. Well, you can imagine that there's certain members within the legislature that would like to just see the oil industry dry up and go away. This helps them. Tax oil companies more, and you're going to end up with less oil companies doing business in Alaska. They will go somewhere else. They're not here for charity. I don't know what that number is. I don't know what the sweet spot is when you cross it and companies just decide to close up their wells and go home, go do something else. But that's part of the struggle in the building, is we need to solve our problem by just increasing oil taxes. The other thing in the building is to create an income tax. The state used to have an income tax. There are members of this building that are very interested in bringing back an income tax. And that income tax would provide revenue from Alaskans and non-Alaskans working in Alaska to help bridge the gap of the budget deficit that we have. And it's a structural imbalance. So that would be one way to tie the people and the economy to the budget. But in my opinion, if you institute a tax, and you institute the tax that some on the left are pushing, which is a high earners tax, then you're pushing out the people in Alaska who you would rely upon for economic growth. It takes money to make money. It takes wealth to create wealth. And if we're going to push people that have amassed wealth and who would use that wealth for the good of themselves and for the state, and we're pushing them out of the state by gradually increasing the income tax to pay for state government, then we're doing ourselves a disservice in regards to the state budget, because we will just incentivize the outward migration of people. So the legislature does not have a will, this legislature, to cut the budget. It hasn't in the last, and I say cut the budget. We have reduced some spending, but not significantly. When we're talking about a $400 million to $1 billion deficit, it is major programmatic change that has to happen in order to make that fill that deficit with budget cuts. And so what we saw with the first Dunleavy administration and his first budget that he rolled out, that the government lobby came unglued at significant budget cuts. And to a certain extent, those that exist within the legislature are still a little gun shy to propose any cuts, because they saw exactly what happened during that time frame. So there is not a will amongst Republicans or Democrats to cut the budget to help solve this problem. That is just the reality. There are not enough people elected that want to see serious conversations about where to cut the money, where to cut the budget, and do government less expensive. So we're not going to get budget cuts this year. I doubt we get them next year. We don't have people that want to vote for a sales tax. Even if an agreement was raised that said you could get a functional spending limit in place with a sales tax, we have people that will not vote for that. So we're not likely to get a spending limit. There's enough people in the legislature that don't want to constrain government spending that they're not going to vote for a spending limit just on itself, right? Because taking the permanent fund dividend and spending all of the permanent fund earnings on government is where they want to go. We're naturally going that direction, so why would we need to change? The government lobby wants to see all of the permanent fund earnings spent on government. That's the natural progression that we're on. It's the only long-term fiscal plan that's in play. But it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve our structural problem, because even if you argue and say, hey, you know what, that's the best purpose of the permanent fund earnings is to spend it on government. Well, the permanent fund earnings is going to grow and government is going to grow. Which is going to grow faster? Eventually you run into a point where your permanent fund earnings doesn't keep up with the size and growth of government. So then you have to have a tax. So we're not interested in doing any sort of program that seems any compromise or spending plan, fiscal plan that includes a combination of a sales tax and a spending limit. And you don't get a solution to the PFD problem all by itself either, because of things that I've already mentioned. So we're looking at, because we won't cut the budget, because we won't say yes to a tax and spending limit compromise, we're not going to be able to save the PFD. That's just the reality of where we're headed. The PFD is going to be spent because we can't do these other things. You don't stem the outward migration from our state, population-wise. You don't stem the economic downturn that we're in with more government spending. You're only going to stem those problems with a vibrant and growing economy. Making sure that some of the permanent fund earnings is directed to the private economy through the PFD program has a stimulating effect to our private sector economy. Eliminating the permanent fund dividend from the people and not having any sort of tax completely disconnects Alaskans from their government. The legislature will only care about what's happening in Prudhoe Bay, what savings we have, and I say Prudhoe Bay, but Prudhoe Bay plus the other corporate income taxes and other tax structures that we have that are minor. They will only care about these three things. How much can we put in savings on the years that we have in excess? How much of the permanent fund earnings can we spend? And how much do we have in savings? These are the only real three mechanisms that we have with state money to solve our government problems. And the people are not connected to any of that when the PFD is gone. So if you want to see limited government, you want to see government that's responsive to people, that's gonna be gone. It's gonna be gone. A government that can find money from sources other than taxing its people means it's a government that doesn't need its people's permission for much of anything. And that's not a healthy Alaska moving forward. So I guess the last thing that I would say on this topic is that that what carries the day down here, what influences the thinking, is the government lobby. It is the institutions, government institutions, both at the state level, so all of our departments. It is local municipalities. It's nonprofits that are serving a quasi-government purpose, meaning their budget is dependent on state and federal funding. And for-profit businesses that also have a business model that relies upon state and federal funding. That's what I describe as our government lobby. And that government lobby, by and large, wants to see the permanent fund earnings spent on state government instead of a dividend, because that helps them stabilize their bottom line. This structure is completely unstable for investors or those with wealth that would come into the state and invest in any sort of opportunity. Because say you're a big corporation that wants to come in, they see an opportunity, but you're going to pay 9%. If you're a large corporation, you're going to pay 9% for corporate income tax right off the top. We get the fourth highest corporate income tax rate in the nation. So it's a structure that disincentivizes economic growth outside of oil or our permanent fund earnings, because the legislature doesn't care. They only care about the money that they've got to spend. They don't care about the part of the economy that's not providing money to the legislature. So that's kind of where that's at. I've spoken for quite a while here. I'm sure there's questions about carbon and ranked choice voting and fiscal plans. We've got a ranked choice voting bill that's coming up in the judiciary that's going to be heard this next week. It's a ranked choice voting, and there's another bill that has to deal with election improvements. Carbon bills are still in play, and we can talk about that if someone wants to. But I think potentially I'll just stop the conversation right now, stop talking and see what questions are out there from folks. So it looks like Charlie France has got a question here. It's the first one I see. Oop, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ben. Yeah, hi, Ben. Thank you for that overview. Can you refresh my memory? My understanding of the change from the original statutory formula for the permanent fund, going from the 21% of earnings to the POMV draw, was to provide a more stable revenue source for the state. Is that?
Yes, Charlie, the effect. So whether you're taking 21% of net earnings or 5% of the market value, those are, you could hold those up and say, hey, those are both got positives and minuses. They're pros and cons for doing either of those. But you're right, choosing to define what your income is from a 5% of market value has a more stable number than using 21% of net earnings, because your earnings from year to year vary more than your total percent of your market value. Your market value tends to not shift as much. So yes, and it wasn't just to pay for state government. Folks also said, hey, it's a way to, early on, it's a way to maintain or have a more stable number in a dividend.
Okay, thanks. The other question, it doesn't sound like that there's anything, you talk about the growth in government, and there's no incentive or no will in the legislature to put any kind of a cap or control on that growth of government with a spending cap or anything realistic. Is that I understand you correct?
That is correct. There are some folks that would like to see a spending limit put in place. There's differing opinions on what type of spending limit, whether it's the one that's being proposed right now, which is by Representative Kaufman and Representative Stapp. They're basically the same bills, a House version and a Senate version, that are tied to the size of our economy, right? So they would say a certain percentage is established as a limit of our gross domestic product, and as the gross domestic product grows, then the state budget would be allowed to grow. That's in an effort to tie the thinking of the legislature to the size of our economy, so that if we focus on doing things like getting government out of the way or incentivizing economic growth, that has a positive effect on government being able to grow. Others say that a spending limit needs to be based on population and inflation. And frankly, we've had a statutory spending limit in place for a long time, and we just ignore it because it doesn't have a constitutional provision that we can't ignore it.
So it's an unrealistic limit too.
Yes, well, the constitutional limit we have is unrealistic. The statutory limit would have been effective at reducing spending half a dozen years over the last decade or so, maybe 2 decades. I'm not sure when that one got established off the top of my head, but we did bust through that limit on several occasions. And again, this goes back to the nature of our constitutional republic here, constitutional form of doing government in the state of Alaska, is that we have a provision in the Constitution that says you can't dedicate funds. And so that means the legislature can appropriate every year regardless of what the statute says. And a statutory spending limit doesn't have any teeth at that point. So if we were to pass HJR 2 that constitutionalizes a requirement to have a spending limit, then the current spending limit would likely be constitutionally enforced, and we wouldn't be able to spend past the limits established in that spending limit. So it is the constitutional piece of this that requires the appropriations process to be subject to existing statute in this regard, that really matters to constraining or providing discipline within the legislature.
So what you're telling us really is that with the lack of willingness to make any kind of spending limits or reductions at all in future growth, that we really don't have a comprehensive fiscal plan. We have a spending plan, is what it sounds like, of how they want to spend the PFD about, but we don't really have, it's not a comprehensive plan at this point.
That's exactly it. It's not comprehensive. It is subject to how much revenue you have every year, and the demand for growth within the state government always looks to our corporations, our business interests, to pay more for taxes, whether it's oil industry or whether it's others through corporate taxes. The business community is, and this is why businesses would not want to come into the state, is because Alaskans, the population, the voters, we don't want to pay taxes, right? We don't want an income or sales tax, but we're okay with businesses paying taxes. That's how we want to fund our government, with business taxes. Well, businesses don't want to pay taxes either. People who own businesses don't want to pay taxes. So there's got to be a happy medium here where the state, the population recognizes that if we want corporations and people with money to come into the state and help grow the economy, then we have to stop leaning on them heavily for taxes, because they're not inclined to come in and do economic development if they know that they're going to have to pay the taxes.
Could you talk a little bit more about the reaction that you're getting or you expect to get from municipalities regarding the sales tax? And then also you touched on the fact that the income tax is going after the high earners. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yep, I can. So the tax proposition that I brought forward is it has some interesting components to it. One of which is that if the municipalities wanted to share in the amount raised by a statewide broad-based sales tax, then they would be able to do so under a couple conditions. So this means any municipality that kept their local property tax mill rate down 10 mills or less, then they would be able to share in the revenue that's generated from a statewide sales tax. Likewise, a municipality would also already not be sharing with state revenue regarding oil property tax or pipeline tax, that type of thing. So really that takes out of the running currently North Slope Borough, Fairbanks, Valdez, Kenai Peninsula from being able to share in the sales tax revenue. But you've got a bunch of other municipalities throughout the state in the Panhandle and Western Alaska that might be struggling with a source of revenue and would be able to share in that sales tax. The bill doesn't set forward that program, so the legislature would have to have a follow-on piece of legislation that would establish that program. But the bill just enables the legislature. It just says the legislature agrees that 50% of the sales tax revenue would be shareable with local municipalities. So potentially, with economic growth, that means your municipalities could reduce their local property taxes and their local sales tax rates if the statewide sales tax was picking up a broader source of economic growth within the state. This isn't a new thing. Other states like Florida have implemented such sales tax, and those states that have sales tax appear to be the ones that are growing. Their economies are growing better than states that have reliance on personal income tax. Again, what are you incentivizing? What are you incentivizing with your tax structure? If you're taxing people because of their income and their work that they're going to do, then you're wanting them to do less of that, or you're promoting them to do less of that. Well, a sales tax also has a negative impact. People won't want to pay as much tax, so they don't spend as much. That has a downwards impact on the economy, because if you didn't have a sales tax, maybe they would spend more. But it also has a positive impact on families. If our families didn't spend because they didn't want to pay the tax for some reason, then they have more money. Like it helps with the savings piece of this. And so much of what we struggle with within our families is not having enough money in savings, and we're living paycheck to paycheck. So if there was an impact to families that they just said, hey, you know what, I'm not going to buy this thing because I'm going to pay taxes on it, then they've got money in the bank. Anyway, I don't see a way to get to a fiscal solution that includes keeping the people tied to the government. If you're going to take no action and allow the PFD to get spent, or take no action and not bring in some sort of tax where the people are paying something for their government, you're just looking at 10 years down the road with trust fund babies, that mentality from the permanent fund earnings, and heavily relying upon industry and business to pay for government. So who do you think lobbies government? Those people who pay taxes. The government doesn't need to listen to the voters in that regard because they don't pay the taxes. So it's a structure that is not sustainable. Other questions? Let me run through the list here and see if there's other questions. I don't see any hands raised. If you've got a question, please find that little hand raise. I don't see any other questions. There's one. Len Neeson?
Yes, thank you. You have talked in general terms about how the legislature feels about things, and that's valuable to know. But I'd also like to know how you feel about it. What do you think is a good solution here?
Yeah, thank you. So let's back up and go back to the screen here. This section right here, the PFD section, the best thing that we could do with the permanent fund dividend earnings is to route it to the private sector. Small businesses, and this isn't just your businesses that are operated out of your homes, but even companies that are employing 50 people are still considered small businesses, right? Small business in the state of Alaska benefit when we spend permanent fund earnings on small businesses. So whether you go on a trip and pay for a plane ticket and pay a tax, or spend that money, that permanent fund dividend on local business, or whether you buy groceries or heating oil or tires or a snow machine or whatever it is that you do with that money, it benefits our private sector economy. So to the extent that I would support 21% of net earnings, which is a larger number, but it fluctuates more, potentially larger in the case where you have more years of low earnings, then it would be a smaller number. But either of those two ways of defining income, getting as much of that money into the private sector helps with maintaining jobs and economic growth, stability within our private sector. Okay, in the current situation here, we can't do that because then we would have no revenue to pay for the size of state government. So personally, I would dive into both the Department of Health and the Department of Education and look for ways to maintain services but do them less costly. It's a difficult task, and it's going to ruffle a lot of feathers. But I would reduce the size of our government because it is bloated. It is all government is, and so that's what I would do. That's what I would like to see. If we're not going to have a permanent fund dividend, then I am in favor of a sales tax. Because if we don't do some sort of taxation, if we don't have some dog in the fight, then as a limited government guy, we're not going to have a say in what happens in our government because we're not going to be paying for it. All of the permanent fund earnings will go to government. All of our oil taxes go to government. And the only people that really care about what's going on at the state government at that point are the people who are paying for it. So it's not a healthy situation to be in as we go forward. I'm not for a high tax. I don't want to see a high income tax and a high sales tax and taxing people for spending. I want to see economic growth. I want to see low taxation, and I want to see limited government. I don't have enough of me to get that done down here.
Thank you for that explanation. For what it's worth, I think, having been a small business owner for many, many years, I think that a sales tax would be less costly for the state to administer and less costly all the way around than income tax. It seems like income tax would just be, on the one hand, giving everybody money through the PFD, and on the other hand, taking the money away from those who work and causing every individual to have to file some kind of form at the end of the year, whereas a sales tax would just be businesses filing the forms, and it would happen in the natural course of business. Every business software is set up to do it. So sales tax does seem like the most logical way to go.
I would agree with you. In our fiscal notes on the corporate income tax, the income tax bills that came before Ways and Means, and the fiscal notes for the sales tax share that same analysis, that the government's cost to maintain and participate in either of those two taxes, the higher cost goes to maintaining a income tax.
Agreed. Thank you.
And let's see, I'm going to go to Wayne, and then I know that we've got some text questions that I need to find here. Mr. Ogle, go right ahead.
And can you hear me all right?
Yeah, you're coming in kind of E2. I don't think you've got a good connection, but I can hear you. Go ahead and ask your question. We'll see if we can get through it.
Real quickly, can you give us your estimate of the carbon tax bills that are, we had a meeting with some against it the other night and they said that the LNG project that would have to be dedicated to social causes or whatever. Sounds pretty onerous to go down a trail of carting and all that kind of thing. But
I understood your question, Wayne, and yes, I can speak to that. I took a trip down this session. I took a trip down to Texas for the CERA Week. That's CERA Week. CERA Week is a energy conference. I was only able to catch the final 2 days down there, but I went down there to try to understand better about this carbon issue and what's going on nationally and worldwide, kind of get the big picture perspective here. What I really wanted to know is, are projects within the state of Alaska, private projects that are funded by investment dollars from large investment funds, are they requiring a state ESG or state carbon policy in order to make those funds available to private enterprise? And the answer that I came back with was yes, it most definitely is happening. If you're going to access funds that are coming from your major players in the business arena, the investment arena, their board of directors are saying, hey, we need you to care about these environmental, social, and governance issues. So you're going to have an ESG policy in order to access our money. Okay, that's why the ConocoPhillips has got an ESG policy. It's got a carbon policy. It had to have that in order to find money for the Willow project. Okay, that's what's happening inside the investment arena. I'm not talking about government regulation. I'm talking about private investors, your BlackRocks, your Goldman Sachs, your large funds that have money that make them available to large corporations that are doing capital investment. They are requiring these policies, right? we don't have a carbon industry. We don't have a need for carbon credits if we didn't have ESG policies. So if you can kind of separate the two in your mind for the argument's sake here, and maybe this is challenging your thinking just a little bit, but the ESG policies, environmental, social, and governance policies, are what's driving companies to seek an alternative to meeting those ESG requirements. Okay, so I've used this example. If you've got a company that wants to invest and they've got a smokestack that the investor says, that smokestack, it pollutes way too much. It produces too much carbon dioxide. I need you to, before I give you any money, I need you to replace that smokestack. And the company says, oh, heck, that's going to cost a lot of money. I can't do it this year, but maybe I can do it in a couple of years, get it on the capital budget a couple of years down the road. Can I go and buy some carbon credits that are reducing carbon somewhere else? And you can give me credit for the pollution that's going on with this smokestack until I can get that smokestack replaced. Because again, I need your money. So I'm incentivized. I have to do business with you if I want to grow. And therefore, I'm going to either have to replace that smokestack or find a different investor. Well, if all of the investors out there are demanding this change, then there's nowhere to go and business dries up. You don't get money to invest. So carbon policies are business's way to continue doing business in an ESG world, in an ESG environment. So you can be anti-ESG, and I know that the federal government Congress is trying to put some brakes to this ESG craziness that's going on. But if you can logically be anti-ESG, meaning we just need to be pro-growth, if you can be anti-ESG and pro-carbon at the same time, then the question is, what is actually happening with the carbon, the cost of carbon? Okay, so if the bills that are before us, which HB 49 and 50 provide basically 50, which is tied to in my mind, is tied to the pipeline getting approved. 50 creates the framework for the administration to come back in and say, here's what our carbon policy, our carbon credit policy is going to be. It also enables the corporations to go seek the 45Q tax credit from the federal government. So it's all a financing piece of this. It's all trying to find a way to continue doing business within this ESG framework. Okay, get rid of that craziness in the ESG framework and the carbon policy vanishes. There's no intrinsic value in carbon. I can't take it home and I can create Perrier with it, sparkling water, but I can't feed it to my family. I can't sell it. I don't use it for anything. There's no intrinsic value for it. But there is value in the fact that you have social credit for doing something, paying money for something that is meeting these ESG goals, right? So in my opinion, if we're going to do carbon credits within the state of Alaska, we don't want to establish a paradigm here where the state looks at it and says, oh, look how much money I can make off these carbon credits. Because if the company's two choices are buy carbon credits or replace the smokestack, it's money that they have to spend on either of those two things, and they're going to pass that cost on to the customer. So all the carbon policy does, if you're going to make money with the state, all it does is force the companies to increase the cost of their good that they're going to be selling to the customer. Okay, that's what the effect is. So really what the state of Alaska should do is like incentivize companies to come to Alaska. Look here, we've got a carbon policy that says if you come do business in Alaska, we can get you dirt cheap carbon credits. They're high quality and they're dirt cheap. That means the company doesn't have to spend as much money getting the social credit for the carbon piece of this, and they can continue doing business. Meanwhile, we continue to fight this ESG thing that is just crazy. If we're going to make money off carbon, then somebody is going to pay the cost. And I say make money from the state's perspective. If we're going to treat it as a resource, Normally we have a resource coming out of the ground, and so we tax it. The theory here is that because we're going to use the reservoir in the ground to shove carbon into the ground, that reservoir is our resource. And so we're going to tax the carbon going into the ground and make money off of it. Well, some customer somewhere is going to have to pay that cost. It's like a tax. If that customer is in Japan, the end customer is the one in Japan that ends up paying that cost. It's not Alaskans paying the cost. If that customer is the lower 48, because that oil, that product, that natural gas, wherever it's going, whatever that company is producing as an end result of the end consumer is buying, is not in Alaska, then you could say, well, at least Alaskans aren't paying that cost. That would be benefit for us, but it is raising costs elsewhere, which just has an inflationary effect on how much everything costs. So yeah, I would like to see the carbon piece of this go away. But in order for it to do that, you would have to see the ESG component, the political persuasion, the leftist approach to forcing us to go towards this utopia. You would have to see that go away. Our companies are trying to operate in that environment, and the carbon industry is cropping up to make money off of it.
Thank you for that.
Hey, Ben, how realistic do you really think the carbon sequestration thing is? I read an article the other day that said that Alaska was thinking they'd make like $100 per unit. I don't remember what it was, a ton or 100 cubic yards or whatever it was of carbon they're going to sequester. And China was saying, heck, we can do it for $6 because we got lots of land, lots of space and all that. What do you think?
That is a hard question to answer. I don't think that we're going to generate the revenue that was initially talked about, but I think you could see companies willing to pay millions of dollars for carbon credits. I think you could see that. It really is subject to the whims of the market. If you're looking at it from a carbon perspective, that is a credit is being marketed out in the credit market, then it really depends. Not all carbon credits are created alike, equal. And what I learned down at the CERAWeek also kind of interesting. There are some companies out there that would like to just, any carbon credit will do, I'll just buy a carbon credit, but then they don't really do their research, and it was a fraud. There wasn't actually technically, scientifically carbon being reduced. Somebody was just saying it was. Okay. Well, then when the environmentalists come after that company and they say, hey, those carbon credits that you paid for, you're not going to get your money back because you already paid for them. Those carbon credits didn't actually do anything. And so you lose social credit because social credit in the news media and you get attacked by the environmentalists because you didn't actually do anything to lower the carbon footprint, right? So they don't want to generate that negative PR. So they go after higher quality carbon credits. If they're going to buy something, they're going to make sure that they get credit for actually reducing carbon. So it has to be high quality. It has to be real sequestration or real capture, real reduction of carbon. As crazy as that sounds, that's what the market is demanding. Okay, so to the extent that oil companies are already putting carbon dioxide down in the ground to help with getting oil out, the technology already exists to put carbon dioxide down in the ground. So we're not doing anything. The companies that the state's talking to aren't proposing something that's not already being done. It may not be being done at the wells that they're going to do it at, like the basin in Cook Inlet. Maybe it is. I'm unaware right now. But the point is the technology is not unsound technology, from my understanding, and we're already doing it. they just aren't getting this carbon credit piece of it because there's not a framework to capture it, to monetize it. And I guess I should also just remind us that there's a couple different situations going on here. One is a carbon market where you create a credit because you've taken carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and you're being credited for doing that, and then you can market that. And then there are tax credits that the federal government will give you for doing activities that reduce your carbon footprint, and that would be the 45Q credits. That's separate. That's a governmental program separate from a credit market where you would be marketing carbon credits. It's a crazy world we live in.
But my garden wants the carbon dioxide.
Agreed. My peonies do. Okay, I'm gonna see if I can find the chat window here. Oh, let's see here. All right. Okay, so Blaze 99712, you said, I see that there's an Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference in Alaska in May, listing all kinds of UN and World Economic Forum speakers for the green energy from around the world. How do we get Governor Dunleavy to break with the money from the sustainable green energy people and open up our oil mining resources inside of Alaska? We need to stop federal money to Alaska and open up Alaska resources. Okay. That's a great question. This segues into both budget considerations and carbon considerations. This conference, while I haven't been told directly, this conference is in timing with decisions that are going to need to be made with the LNG project. So the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation is proceeding with the gas pipeline. Let me back up and say they're not building the pipeline. They're proceeding with the planning to get to a point where there can be a final investment decision as to whether we're going to build the pipeline. And right now, the Gas Line Corporation is working with producers and buyers. And I'll tie this into the question, I promise. They're working with producers and buyers to reach an agreement on a price for natural gas, long-term price coming off the North Slope, some kind of pricing structure. At the same time, Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation has entered into an agreement with Goldman Sachs to enable or allow Goldman Sachs to go out and collect or round up investors willing to invest in the gas line that could be built, that's already permitted, okay? Sometime this year, we're going to have feedback or answers from both of those efforts. We're going to know whether there's an agreement between the buyers and the sellers of the natural gas, and we're going to know whether there's an agreement amongst investors that they want to invest in this project. Because Goldman Sachs is spearheading the investment piece of this for AGDC, and they're participating in the Sustainable Energy Conference, I suspect that the two are related. I don't know that for a fact, but it makes sense to me. CERA Week was just 4 weeks ago. Much of what they're probably going to talk about at this energy conference was covered in the big conference down there. CERA Week is the mother of all energy conferences. So some of those individuals that were at CERA Week are coming to this Sustainable Energy Conference in Alaska. So if you can think that there's an effort here to try to get the pipeline built within the ESG world, right? The ESG world that we live in, the carbon piece is part of that equation to getting that gas line built. There's no doubt in my mind that is the case. The question references federal money. I don't want to speak out of turn, but I don't know that there is a large amount of federal dollars that are going to be spent on the pipeline. I do know that there is a large amount of federal dollars authorized to back the project. meaning that if it defaults, there's the investors have the federal government to fall back on. But I'm not sure that the federal government is actually forwarding money to get the gas line built. That could have changed with the sorry, just lost the acronym, the energy bills that passed, the large sums of money that passed at the federal level. Maybe there is federal dollars tied to it, but largely this project is being financed, will be financed by private dollars. I say private. It could also be dollars coming from overseas, from whoever's going to be the buyers, Korea, Japan, others. So I don't know that there's any way to stop, or the question would be, are you wanting to stop all of the conversation on the sustainable energy if it means you don't get a gas pipeline? Like, growing our economy in Alaska requires, in South Central Alaska and Interior Alaska, requires lower cost energy. There's no two ways about that. So we're either going to build a hydroelectric dam somewhere, we're either going to bring in nuclear plants, we have to bring in some source of energy generation capacity to lower the cost of electricity and natural gas in South Central and Interior Alaska if we want to experience economic growth. From a farming perspective, if I want to grow crops indoors, hydroponically, and I can tap into that $2 billion of revenue that leaves the state every year to buy food from farmers in the lower 48 and other countries. If I want to be able to grow food year round, I need low cost electricity. They're already doing it here in Juneau. They've got a company down here that's growing basil and lettuce year round, indoors, hydroponically. And they've got low cost electricity because they've got a hydroelectric plant here that's producing low cost electricity. So if we want economic activity to happen, we have to have some answer to reducing the cost of electricity. And I don't buy in that we're going to be able to do it by producing windmills and solar panels to drive down the cost. So if we take action that stops the gas line corporation or the AGDC from being successful at getting a gas pipeline, then we might be cutting off our nose to spite our face. That's not to say that we shouldn't still be fighting this ESG nonsense, but realize the world that we're operating in right now. I hope that answered the question. Any other questions? I see phone numbers and names and stuff. I'm not sure who else is out there. There's another message popped up. Oh, it's a thank you. You're welcome. Any other questions? Comments?
Thank you very much for taking the time to share your information with us, Ben. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Charlie. It was good to see your face and hear your voice.
Talk about wind generation. On our trip this winter, we were down through South Texas, and I have never seen so many wind farms and stuff. And it's amazing when you drive through the things, about a third to a half of them were non-functional. They were shut down. Mechanical problems or issues with them, they weren't working. It's interesting.
It's interesting also to know that when the wind gets too strong, when it's blowing too hard, they have to shut those things down. They can't actually function in high wind situations. So that might be part of the problem too. 20 years from now, you're going to have to replace all that equipment. Cost a lot to get it up there, and the only way that you can afford to put those windmills up are a government subsidy. So is the government going to be subsidizing the replacement of them in 20 years? Anyway, Well, folks, thank you for joining me. And please, if you have questions, you can call my office. I'm looking for 3779, I think is my number here, 465-3779, or drop me an email, rep.ben.carpenter@akleg.gov. You can go to my website, bencarpenterpost.com, and there's a live chat feature there that you can get on and talk to my staff during the day. Those are the ways to contact me. So if you have questions, or if you're following up on this this video feed afterwards and have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. So anyway, thanks all for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend wherever you are.
Thank you.